The early morning sun struggled to pierce through the thick clouds hanging over the small town of San Esperanza. Amidst the bustling market square, a man in his late 30s diligently arranged vibrant fruits and vegetables in neat rows. His weathered hands moved with practiced ease, each placement deliberate and careful. This was Alejandro Mendoza, known throughout the town for his kind heart and unwavering work ethic. "Good morning, Don Alejandro," a cheerful voice called out. It was Maria, an elderly regular customer who never failed to brighten Alejandro's day with her warm smile. "Buenos dias, Dona Maria," Alejandro replied, his eyes crinkling with genuine warmth. "How are you this fine morning? I have some fresh avocados just for you." As he handed Maria her produce, Alejandro's gaze wandered to the ornate clock tower looming over the square. His smile faltered for a moment as he realized it was almost time for his wife, Isabella, to make her daily visit. He loved her dearly, but lately, something felt off. Isabella Mendoza was a vision of beauty as she glided through the market, her designer handbag swinging gently at her side. Heads turned as she passed, men admiring her grace while women whispered enviously behind their hands. How such a stunning creature had ended up with humble Alejandro was the subject of much speculation. "Alejandro, mi amor," Isabella cooed as she approached the stand. Her voice was honey-sweet, but there was a coldness in her eyes that sent a shiver down Alejandro's spine. "Isabella," he greeted her, wiping his hands on his apron. "You look beautiful as always. How was your morning?" Isabella's lips curved into a practiced smile. "Oh, you know. The usual. Breakfast with the girls at Café Dorado." She glanced around the modest vegetable stand with barely concealed disdain. "I was thinking, perhaps it's time we considered other ventures? This stand, it's so quaint. But surely you want more for us." Alejandro's brow furrowed. They'd had this conversation before, and it always left him feeling inadequate. "Isabella, you know this stand has been in my family for generations. It may not be glamorous, but it's honest work. We make enough to live comfortably." "Comfortable?" Isabella scoffed, her mask of affection slipping for a moment. "Alejandro, we live in a tiny apartment above your parents' house. That's not comfort, that's settling." Before Alejandro could respond, a sleek black car pulled up to the curb. The tinted window rolled down, revealing a handsome man with slicked back hair and a Rolex glinting on his wrist. "Isabella, Carino," the man called out. "Are you ready for our business meeting?" Alejandro's heart sank as he watched his wife's face light up. "Of course, Roberto. I'll be right there." She turned back to Alejandro, not quite meeting his eyes. "I have to go, darling. Important matters to discuss with Señor Fuentes. Don't wait up for me tonight." As Isabella sashayed away, Alejandro couldn't shake the feeling that his world was about to come crashing down around him. Little did he know, the true extent of his wife's betrayal would soon be revealed, setting in motion a chain of events that would test his faith, his love, and the very essence of his gentle nature. Across town, in a lavish penthouse overlooking the city, Roberto Fuentes poured 2 glasses of champagne. "To us, my dear," he toasted, clinking his glass against Isabella's. "And to the fool who makes it all possible." Isabella giggled, a sound that would have broken Alejandro's heart had he heard it. "He suspects nothing," she assured Roberto. "Soon, everything will be ours." As the day wore on, Alejandro couldn't shake the gnawing feeling in his gut. He closed up shop early, his mind swimming with doubts and fears. Walking home, he passed by the local church and paused, drawn by some inexplicable force. Inside, he found Father Hernandez, the kindly old priest who had known Alejandro since he was a boy. "Alejandro, my son," Father Hernandez greeted him warmly. "What troubles you?" I can see the weight on your shoulders. Alejandro sank into a pew, his head in his hands. Father, I fear I'm losing my wife. She's changed, become distant. And there's this man, Roberto Fuentes. Father Hernandez listened patiently as Alejandro poured out his heart. When the younger man had finished, the priest placed a comforting hand on his shoulder. Faith, Alejandro. Have faith in yourself, in the goodness of your heart. The path ahead may be difficult, but remember that true strength comes from kindness and integrity. Alejandro left the church feeling somewhat lighter, but his troubles were far from over. As he approached his parents' house, he saw a familiar car parked across the street, Roberto's sleek black sedan. His heart racing, Alejandro crept closer, staying hidden in the shadows. Through the car's tinted windows, he could make out two figures locked in a passionate embrace. Even in the dim light, there was no mistaking Isabella's silhouette. Alejandro's world spun, his legs threatening to give out beneath him. But before he could confront them, the car roared to life and sped away, leaving Alejandro alone with his shattered heart. Stumbling into the small apartment he shared with Isabella, Alejandro's eyes fell on a stack of papers on the kitchen table. His hands trembling, he picked them up, his eyes widening in disbelief as he read. They were transfer documents, legal papers that would sign over ownership of his family's market stand to Roberto Fuentes. And there, at the bottom of the page, was a forged version of his own signature. The betrayal was complete. Not only had Isabella been unfaithful, but she and Roberto had been plotting to steal everything Alejandro held dear. His business, his livelihood, his very identity, all of it was at risk. As the rain began to fall outside, matching the tears that streamed down Alejandro's face, he sank to his knees. How could he fight this? He was just a simple man, up against forces that seemed insurmountable. But deep within his chest, a small flame of determination flickered to life. He would not give up. He would not let bitterness consume him. Somehow, someway, Alejandro Mendoza would find a way to overcome this betrayal, to protect what was his, and perhaps, just perhaps, to open his heart to love again. Little did Alejandro know, his journey was just beginning. The twists and turns that lay ahead would test him in ways he could never have imagined, and the truth he would uncover about Roberto Fuentes would shake the very foundations of San Esperanza itself. The sun rose over San Esperanza, its warm rays a stark contrast to the cold dread that had settled in Alejandro's heart. He hadn't slept, the weight of Isabella's betrayal and the looming threat to his family's legacy keeping him awake through the long, dark night. As he made his way to the market square, each step felt heavier than the last. The usual bustle of the morning crowd seemed muted, as if the very air knew of Alejandro's pain. He mechanically began setting up his stand, the routine movements offering little comfort. Just as he placed the last crate of tomatoes, a booming voice cut through the quiet. Alejandro Mendoza! The voice belonged to Don Fernando, the wealthiest landowner in San Esperanza and Roberto Fuentes' father-in-law. The old man's face was twisted with rage as he stormed towards the humble vegetable stand. You miserable, ungrateful wretch! Alejandro's confusion only added to his distress. Don Fernando? What's wrong? What have I done? The older man thrust a crumpled newspaper into Alejandro's hands. Read it, you snake! See how you've repaid my family's kindness. With trembling hands, Alejandro unfolded the paper. His eyes widened in shock as he read the headline, Local Merchant Accused of Embezzlement and Fraud. The article went on to detail how Alejandro Mendoza had allegedly been siphoning money from a charity fund set up by the Fuentes family to help local businesses. But this isn't true. Alejandro protested, his voice cracking. I would never. Save your lies. Don Fernando spat. Roberto trusted you, gave you access to the fund's accounts. And this is how you repay him? By stealing from those in need? A crowd had begun to gather, whispers and accusatory glances cutting Alejandro to his core. Among the onlookers, he spotted Maria, the kindly old woman from yesterday. The disappointment in her eyes was almost more than he could bear. "Please," Alejandro begged, turning to the crowd. "You know me. I've served this community my whole life. I would never steal, especially not from those in need." But his pleas fell on deaf ears. The damage had been done. As Don Fernando continued to berate him, Alejandro saw his whole world crumbling around him. Not only had he lost his wife, but now his reputation, the one thing he had always prized above all else, was in tatters. Just when it seemed things couldn't get worse, the crowd parted to reveal Chief Inspector Ramirez. The stern-faced officer approached Alejandro, a pair of handcuffs glinting ominously in the morning sun. "Alejandro Mendoza," Ramirez intoned solemnly, "you're under arrest for fraud and embezzlement. You have the right to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you in a court of law." As the cold metal clasped around his wrists, Alejandro's eyes searched the crowd desperately. They landed on a familiar face, Isabella, standing at the back, her expression unreadable. For a brief moment, their gazes locked. Alejandro silently pleaded with her, begging for help, for some sign that she still believed in him. But Isabella simply turned away, linking her arm with Roberto Fuentes, who had appeared beside her. The couple walked away, leaving Alejandro to face his fate alone. The jail cell was cold and damp, a far cry from the warm, vibrant world Alejandro had known. Hours passed like days as he sat on the hard bench, his mind reeling. How had everything gone so wrong so quickly? He thought of his parents, of the shame they must be feeling. He thought of the vegetables wilting in the sun, his livelihood abandoned. A key turned in the lock, and Alejandro looked up to see Chief Inspector Ramirez entering the cell. The older man's face was grim, but there was a hint of something else in his eyes, doubt, perhaps? "Mendoza," Ramirez began, his voice gruff. "I've known you since you were a boy. Never thought I'd see you on this side of the bars." Alejandro met the inspector's gaze steadily. "I'm innocent, Chief. I swear on my mother's life." Ramirez studied him for a long moment before sighing heavily. "The evidence against you is strong, Alejandro. Bank transfers, forged signatures, it doesn't look good." "It's all lies," Alejandro insisted, rising to his feet. "Someone has set me up. Please, you have to believe me." The inspector held up a hand, silencing Alejandro's protests. "I don't know what to believe right now. But listen to me carefully, if you're telling the truth, if someone really has framed you, you need to be smart. Keep your head down, watch your back. Not everyone in this town is as they seem." With those cryptic words, Ramirez left, the cell door clanging shut behind him. Alejandro sank back onto the bench, his mind racing. What did the inspector mean? Could there be more to this conspiracy than he realized? As night fell, bringing with it a bone-chilling cold, Alejandro was startled by a soft voice calling his name. He looked up to see Father Hernandez standing outside his cell, his kind face etched with concern. "My son," the priest said gently, "I've come to offer what comfort I can." Alejandro moved closer to the bars, grateful for a friendly face. "Father, I swear to you, I'm innocent. I would never steal, especially not from those in need." Father Hernandez nodded solemnly. "I believe you, Alejandro. Your heart has always been pure. But faith alone may not be enough in this dark hour. You must be strong, and you must be clever." The priest glanced around furtively before leaning in close. "Listen carefully," he whispered. "There are forces at work in San Esperanza that go beyond what you see on the surface. Roberto Fuentes is not who he claims to be. I've heard rumors. Disturbing rumors. Alejandro's pulse quickened. What kind of rumors, Father? I cannot say more here, Father Hernandez replied, his eyes darting nervously to the guards. But know this, the path to your salvation may lie in uncovering the truth about Roberto Fuentes. Be patient, my son. God works in mysterious ways. With a final blessing, the priest departed, leaving Alejandro with more questions than answers. As he lay on the hard cot that night, sleep eluding him, Alejandro's mind whirled with possibilities. What secrets was Roberto hiding? And how could he, a simple vegetable seller, hope to uncover them from behind bars? Little did Alejandro know, fate was already setting wheels in motion that would change everything. Miles away, in the opulent Fuentes mansion, Isabella paced nervously in Roberto's study. The gravity of what they had done was finally sinking in, and guilt gnawed at her conscience. Roberto, she began hesitantly, are you sure this was necessary? Alejandro is many things, but he's not a criminal. We've destroyed him completely. Roberto looked up from his desk, his handsome face twisted into a sneer. Having second thoughts, my dear? Remember, you're as much a part of this as I am. There's no going back now. Isabella shuddered at the coldness in his voice. This was not the charming, passionate man she had fallen for. For the first time, she glimpsed something truly dark behind Roberto's polished facade. Besides, Roberto continued, rising to pour himself a drink, Alejandro was a means to an end. With him out of the way and the Mendoza market stand in our possession, we're one step closer to our true goal. And what goal is that? Isabella asked, a tremor of fear in her voice. Roberto's smile was chilling. Why, the complete takeover of San Esperanza, of course. This town has been under the thumb of families like the Fernandos for too long. It's time for a change in management. As the implications of Roberto's words sank in, Isabella felt a wave of nausea wash over her. What had she gotten herself into? And more importantly, how could she find a way out? Back in his cell, Alejandro was jolted from his fitful sleep by the sound of a commotion in the jail. Shouts and the pounding of feet echoed through the corridors. Suddenly, his cell door swung open, revealing a breathless guard. Mendoza! You need to come quickly, the guard exclaimed. Confused and wary, Alejandro followed the guard through the winding halls of the jail. They emerged into the front office, where a crowd had gathered around a television set. On the screen, a breaking news report was playing. Shocking turn of events, the reporter was saying. Roberto Fuentes, prominent businessman and philanthropist, has been linked to a massive international money laundering operation. Sources close to the investigation claim that the charity fund at the center of the Mendoza embezzlement case may have been a front for illegal activities. Alejandro's head spun as he tried to process the information. Could this be the truth Father Hernandez had hinted at? As he watched, the report continued, revealing a web of corruption that stretched far beyond San Esperanza. Chief Inspector Ramirez approached Alejandro, a mix of embarrassment and determination on his face. Mendoza, it seems we owe you an apology. In light of this new evidence, all charges against you are being dropped. You're free to go. Relief flooded through Alejandro, but it was tempered by a burning need to understand. As he collected his belongings and stepped out into the cool night air, he knew his ordeal was far from over. Roberto Fuentes may have been exposed, but there were still so many unanswered questions. What role had Isabella played in all of this? Could their marriage be saved, or was the betrayal too deep? And what of the Mendoza market stand? Could Alejandro reclaim his family's legacy? As he walked the quiet streets of San Esperanza, Alejandro's mind raced with possibilities. He had been humbled, betrayed, and pushed to his limits. But he had survived. Now, it was time to reclaim his life and uncover the full truth behind the conspiracy that had nearly destroyed him. Little did Alejandro know, the revelations about Roberto Fuentes were just the tip of the iceberg. Hidden in the shadows, powerful forces were already mobilizing. The humble vegetable seller from San Esperanza was about to find himself at the center of a storm that would shake the very foundations of his world. As dawn broke over the town, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold, Alejandro stood at the crossroads of his destiny. The path ahead was uncertain, fraught with danger and the potential for more heartbreak. But deep in his heart, a fire had been kindled, a determination to seek justice, to protect his community, and perhaps, just perhaps, to find love again. The true test of Alejandro's character was about to begin, and the eyes of San Esperanza, and beyond, would be watching. The early morning mist clung to the cobblestone streets of San Esperanza as Alejandro made his way to the market square. His heart raced with a mixture of anticipation and dread. After the whirlwind of events, his arrest, the revelations about Roberto Fuentes, and his subsequent release, Alejandro was unsure what awaited him at his beloved vegetable stand. As he rounded the corner, he stopped dead in his tracks. Where his simple wooden stall had once stood, there was now nothing. The space was empty, swept clean as if the Mendoza family had never been there at all. "No," Alejandro whispered, his voice choked with emotion. "It can't be." "I'm afraid it is, my friend," came a familiar voice. Alejandro turned to see Maria, the elderly customer who had been coming to his stand for years. Her eyes were filled with sympathy. They came in the night, men in suits. They took everything. Alejandro's knees threatened to give way beneath him. The stand had been more than just a business, it was his heritage, his connection to generations of Mendozas who had served this community. And now, it was gone. As he stood there, trying to process this latest blow, a commotion erupted at the far end of the square. A crowd was gathering, their voices raised in anger and disbelief. Alejandro made his way over, pushing through the throng until he could see what had caused such an uproar. There, plastered on the wall of the town hall, was a notice. In bold letters, it proclaimed, "Attention citizens of San Esperanza. By order of the new town council, all privately owned businesses in the market square are hereby transferred to Fuentes Enterprises, effective immediately. This action is taken in the interest of economic development and progress." The notice was signed by none other than Don Fernando, Roberto's father-in-law. Alejandro felt as if he had been punched in the gut. It wasn't just his stand, every small business owner in the square was being stripped of their livelihood. The realization hit him like a thunderbolt, this had been Roberto's plan all along. The charity fund, the false accusations against Alejandro, it had all been a smokescreen for a much larger scheme. As the crowd's anger grew, Alejandro spotted a familiar face at the edge of the square. Isabella stood there, her eyes wide with shock as she took in the scene. For a moment, their gazes met across the sea of people. Alejandro saw something flicker in her eyes, regret? Fear? Before he could approach her, she turned and hurried away, disappearing down a side street. Suddenly, a hand gripped Alejandro's shoulder. He turned to find Chief Inspector Ramirez standing beside him, his face grim. "Mendoza," the inspector said in a low voice, "we need to talk." "Not here. Meet me at the old lighthouse in an hour." "Come alone." Before Alejandro could respond, Ramirez melted into the crowd, leaving him with more questions than ever. The next hour passed in a blur. Alejandro wandered the streets of San Esperanza in a daze, his mind reeling from the morning's events. The town he had known and loved all his life seemed to be crumbling around him, its very soul under attack by forces he was only beginning to understand. As the appointed time approached, Alejandro made his way to the abandoned lighthouse that stood sentinel at the edge of town. The structure had been out of use for years, its paint peeling and windows boarded up. It was an unlikely place for a clandestine meeting, but perhaps that was the point. He found Ramirez waiting inside, along with an unexpected guest, Father Hernandez. The two men wore matching expressions of grave concern. "Alejandro," Father Hernandez began, his voice heavy with worry, "what's happening to our town goes far beyond simple greed or corruption. We believe Roberto Fuentes is merely a pawn in a much larger game." Ramirez nodded, pulling out a stack of documents from his coat. "We've been investigating Fuentes for months, but it wasn't until your arrest that things started to fall into place. Look at this." He spread the papers out on a dusty old table. Alejandro leaned in, his eyes widening as he took in bank statements, property deeds, and what looked like coded messages. "Fuentes Enterprises isn't just a local business," Ramirez explained. "It's a front for an international crime syndicate. They've been buying up small towns like San Esperanza all across the country, using them as bases for their operations, drug trafficking, money laundering, you name it." Alejandro felt the blood drain from his face. "But why our town? We're just simple people." Father Hernandez placed a comforting hand on Alejandro's shoulder. "Because of its strategic location, my son. Our little port has always been a hub for trade. In the wrong hands, it could become a gateway for all manner of illegal activities." As the full scope of the threat became clear, Alejandro's shock gave way to a steely resolve. "What can we do? How can we stop this?" Ramirez and Father Hernandez exchanged a look. "That's where you come in, Alejandro," the inspector said. "We need someone on the inside, someone above suspicion who can gather evidence and help us bring down this operation." "Me?" Alejandro's voice cracked with disbelief. "But I'm just a vegetable seller. What can I possibly do?" Father Hernandez smiled, a glimmer of his old warmth showing through. "You are far more than that, my son. You are the heart of this community. The people trust you, respect you. And more importantly, the Fuentes organization believes they've neutralized you as a threat." Ramirez nodded in agreement. "We want you to approach Roberto, to convince him you want revenge against the town that turned its back on you. If we can get you inside their operation, we might have a chance of saving San Esperanza." Alejandro's mind raced. The task seemed impossible, fraught with danger. And yet, wasn't this what his parents had always taught him? To stand up for what was right, no matter the cost? "I'll do it," he said finally, his voice steady despite the fear churning in his gut. "For San Esperanza. For my family's legacy. I'll do whatever it takes." As the three men began to plan their dangerous gambit, none of them noticed the shadow that flitted past the lighthouse window, a figure that had overheard every word of their conversation. Across town, in the opulent Fuentes mansion, Roberto paced his study like a caged tiger. The news of his criminal connections had spread like wildfire, and he could feel his carefully constructed world beginning to crumble. "How could this happen?" he snarled, rounding on Isabella, who sat quietly in the corner. "Who could have leaked that information to the press?" Isabella flinched at the rage in his voice. I don't know, Roberto. Perhaps someone in your organization." "Silence!" Roberto roared, slamming his fist on the desk. "I want names, Isabella. I want to know who dared to betray me. And when I find out." His voice trailed off, the threat hanging heavy in the air. As Isabella watched her husband, was he even that anymore? Spiral into paranoia and fury, she felt a chill run down her spine. This was not the charming, ambitious man she had fallen for. This was a monster, one she had helped create through her own greed and weakness. Her thoughts turned to Alejandro, to the hurt and betrayal she had seen in his eyes. She had thrown away a good man's love for, what? Power? Excitement? Now, as she looked around the gilded cage she found herself in, Isabella realized the terrible mistake she had made. A commotion at the front of the house drew their attention. Roberto strode to the window, peering out at the gathering crowd of protesters. Their angry chants echoed through the grounds. "Fuentes out! Save our town! Fuentes out! Save our town!" Roberto's face twisted into a sneer. "Let them shout," he spat. "Soon, they'll learn the price of defiance. San Esperanza will be ours, Isabella. No matter who we have to crush to make it happen." As he turned away from the window, a glint of something dangerous in his eyes, Isabella made a silent vow. She had to find a way to make things right, to undo the damage she had helped cause. But how? And was it already too late? Meanwhile, back in the heart of town, Alejandro stood before the empty space where his family's stand had once been. The weight of the task ahead pressed down on him, threatening to overwhelm his spirit. But as he looked around at the faces of his neighbors, confused, angry, afraid, he felt a surge of determination. This was his home. These were his people. And he would fight for them with every ounce of strength he possessed. Taking a deep breath, Alejandro squared his shoulders and began to walk purposefully towards the Fuentes mansion. It was time to set their plan in motion, to begin the dangerous game of deception that might be San Esperanza's only hope. As he walked, memories flooded his mind, of his parents teaching him the value of hard work and integrity, of the countless mornings spent arranging fruits and vegetables with care, of the smiles and laughter shared with customers who had become friends over the years. All of it was at stake now. Not just his own future, but the very soul of San Esperanza. Alejandro's steps faltered as he approached the imposing gates of the Fuentes estate. Doubt crept in, whispering that he was in over his head, that he should turn back before it was too late. But then he thought of Father Hernandez's faith in him, of Chief Ramirez's trust. He thought of Maria and all the others who had supported him through the years. He couldn't let them down. He wouldn't. With a silent prayer for strength and guidance, Alejandro pressed the intercom button. A crackle of static, then a curt voice, "State your business." Alejandro took a deep breath, steeling himself for the performance of his life. "Tell Señor Fuentes that Alejandro Mendoza is here to see him. I have a proposition he might find interesting." A long pause, then the gates began to swing open with an ominous creak. As Alejandro stepped onto the manicured grounds of the Fuentes mansion, he felt as if he were walking into the lion's den. Little did he know, the true test of his courage and integrity was only just beginning. For within those walls, secrets lurked that would shake San Esperanza to its very foundations, secrets that would force Alejandro to confront not only the darkness in others, but the shadows within his own heart as well. As the front door of the mansion opened, revealing Roberto Fuentes himself, Alejandro sent up one last, desperate prayer. "God give me strength," he whispered. "For San Esperanza. For justice. For redemption." And with that, he stepped across the threshold, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. The fate of his beloved town, and perhaps his own soul, hung in the balance. Inside the opulent foyer of the Fuentes mansion, Alejandro found himself face to face with the man who had orchestrated his downfall. Roberto Fuentes stood before him, impeccably dressed in a tailored suit, a glass of whiskey in his hand. His smile was all charm, but his eyes were cold and calculating. "Alejandro Mendoza," Roberto purred, gesturing expansively. "What an unexpected pleasure. I must say, I'm surprised to see you here, given our recent misunderstandings." Alejandro swallowed hard, forcing himself to meet Roberto's gaze. "Misunderstandings?" he echoed, allowing a hint of bitterness to creep into his voice. "Is that what you call destroying a man's life and legacy?" Roberto's smile never wavered. Come now, Alejandro. Surely you can appreciate the art of good business? Sometimes sacrifices must be made for the greater good. The greater good? Alejandro scoffed, his hands clenching into fists at his sides. You mean your own pockets? You've taken everything from me, Fuentes. My reputation, my livelihood, even my wife. At the mention of Isabella, something flickered in Roberto's eyes, a flash of possessiveness, perhaps even fear. But it was gone in an instant, replaced by that same calculating coolness. And yet here you are, Roberto mused, taking a sip of his whiskey. Not seeking revenge, I hope? That would be unfortunate for all involved. Alejandro forced a bitter laugh. Revenge? No, Fuentes. I'm here because I've realized something. This town, these people, they turned their backs on me the moment things got tough. Why should I care what happens to them now? Roberto's eyebrows rose in genuine surprise. Go on, he said, his interest clearly piqued. You want San Esperanza? Alejandro continued, his heart racing even as he maintained his facade of cynical indifference. Take it. But I know this town, its people, its secrets. I could be useful to you. For a long moment, Roberto studied Alejandro, seeming to weigh every word, every micro-expression. The tension in the room was palpable, the only sound the ticking of an antique clock on the mantel. Finally, Roberto's face split into a wide grin. Well, he chuckled, clapping Alejandro on the shoulder. It seems our humble vegetable cellar has hidden depths. Come, my friend. Let's discuss this proposition of yours in more detail. As Roberto led him deeper into the mansion, Alejandro sent up a silent prayer of thanks. The first hurdle had been cleared. He was in. But the real challenge was only just beginning. What Alejandro couldn't know, was that at that very moment, another player was entering the game. A figure moved silently through the shadows of San Esperanza, watching, waiting, gathering information. This mysterious observer had their own agenda, their own secrets to protect. And as the sun began to set over the troubled town, casting long shadows across its winding streets, the stage was set for a confrontation that would change everything. The humble man's journey from betrayal to redemption was about to take a turn that no one, not Alejandro, not Roberto, not even the puppet masters pulling the strings from afar, could have anticipated. The fate of San Esperanza hung in the balance, and the clock was ticking. The following weeks were a whirlwind of activity for Alejandro. On the surface, he had become Roberto Fuentes' new right-hand man, privy to the inner workings of the criminal empire that threatened to consume San Esperanza. But beneath this facade, Alejandro was engaged in a dangerous dance of deception, gathering evidence and feeding information to Chief Inspector Ramirez and Father Hernandez. Each night, as he lay in bed in the small apartment Roberto had generously provided, Alejandro felt the weight of his double life pressing down on him. The things he had seen, the conversations he had been part of, they haunted his dreams and tested his resolve. One particularly tense evening found Alejandro in Roberto's study, poring over documents detailing the next phase of Fuentes Enterprises' takeover of San Esperanza. As he discreetly photographed the papers with a tiny camera provided by Ramirez, the door suddenly swung open. Alejandro's heart leapt into his throat, but it wasn't Roberto who entered. It was Isabella. For a moment, they simply stared at each other, the air thick with unspoken words and lingering betrayal. Isabella looked thinner, paler than Alejandro remembered, dark circles shadowing her once bright eyes. Alejandro, she whispered, her voice trembling. What are you doing here? Thinking quickly, Alejandro gestured to the papers on the desk. Working late, he said, his tone carefully neutral. Your husband keeps me busy. Isabella flinched at the word husband, her gaze dropping to the floor. Alejandro, I need to talk to you about everything that's happened. Please. Before Alejandro could respond, heavy footsteps echoed in the hallway. Roberto's voice boomed out, calling for Isabella. Panic flashed across her face. Meet me tomorrow, she hissed urgently. Noon, at the old church ruins outside town. Please, Alejandro. It's important. With that, she was gone, leaving Alejandro alone with his racing thoughts and the damning evidence spread before him. The next day, as the sun reached its zenith, Alejandro made his way to the crumbling ruins of the old church. The structure had been abandoned decades ago when the new cathedral was built in town, its weathered stones now a haven for wildflowers and nesting birds. He found Isabella waiting in the shadow of a broken archway, her elegant clothes out of place among the ruins. As he approached, he saw tears glimmering in her eyes. You came, she breathed, relief evident in her voice. I came, Alejandro agreed, keeping his distance. Now, what's this about, Isabella? Why the secrecy? Isabella wrung her hands, her composure cracking. Alejandro, I've made a terrible mistake. All of this, Roberto, the business, betraying you, it's all gone so horribly wrong. I never meant for things to go this far. Alejandro felt a mix of emotions surge through him, anger, hurt, and beneath it all, a traitorous flicker of the love he had once felt for this woman. What did you think would happen, Isabella? He asked, his voice harder than he intended. Did you really believe there would be no consequences? I was blind, Isabella admitted, tears now flowing freely. Blind with ambition, with the promise of a life beyond the small town. Roberto, he showed me a world I'd only dreamed of. But now I see the truth. He's a monster, Alejandro. And I've helped him hurt so many people. Alejandro's mind raced. Could this be genuine remorse? Or was it another trap, a ploy to test his loyalty to Roberto? He had to tread carefully. Why are you telling me this? He asked, watching her closely. Isabella took a deep, shuddering breath. Because I want to make things right. I have information, Alejandro. Documents, recordings, evidence of everything Roberto and his associates have done. I want to turn it over to the authorities, but I'm scared. Roberto, he's dangerous when he's crossed. Alejandro's pulse quickened. If Isabella was telling the truth, this could be the break they needed to bring down the entire operation. But the risk was enormous. And what do you want from me? He asked, still wary. Protection, Isabella said simply. Help me get this information to the right people. And forgiveness, though I know I don't deserve it. As Alejandro wrestled with this unexpected turn of events, a twig snapped in the undergrowth nearby. Both he and Isabella whirled towards the sound, fear etched on their faces. From behind a crumbling wall emerged a figure Alejandro had not expected to see, Maria, the elderly woman from the market. But gone was her usual warmth and gentleness. Her eyes were sharp, her posture taut with purpose. Well, Maria said, her voice carrying an authority Alejandro had never heard before. What have we here? A lover's reunion? Or something more treasonous? Alejandro's mind reeled. Maria? What are you doing here? How did you find you? Maria finished, a wry smile playing at her lips. My dear Alejandro, did you really think you were the only one working undercover in San Esperanza? With a fluid motion that belied her apparent age, Maria produced a badge from her pocket. Agent Maria Vasquez, Interpol. I've been tracking the Fuentes operation for years. And now, it seems, all the pieces are finally falling into place. Isabella gasped, her eyes wide with shock. Interpol? But how? Maria's gaze hardened as she turned to Isabella. Mrs. Fuentes, your desire to come clean is admirable, if a bit late. But I'm afraid your husband's reach extends far beyond this little town. The information you have could be the key to bringing down an international criminal network. Alejandro's head spun as he tried to process this new development. All this time, he murmured, "You were watching us? Even when I was arrested?" Maria's expression softened slightly. "I'm sorry for the deception, Alejandro. But your integrity, your commitment to this community, they made you the perfect insider. We needed someone Roberto would believe had been pushed to the breaking point." As the full implications of the situation became clear, a new sense of purpose filled Alejandro. This was bigger than his own hurt, bigger even than San Esperanza. They had a chance to strike a blow against a criminal empire that had hurt countless lives. "What do we do now?" he asked, straightening his shoulders. Maria smiled, a glint of approval in her eyes. "Now, my dear friends, we set a trap. One that Roberto Fuentes and his entire organization will never see coming." As the three unlikely allies began to plan, none of them noticed the small drone hovering high above the ruins, its camera capturing every word, every gesture. In his luxurious office, Roberto Fuentes leaned back in his chair, a cruel smile playing at his lips as he watched the live feed. "Oh, Isabella," he murmured, swirling a glass of expensive cognac. "You should have known better than to betray me. And you, Alejandro. I had such hopes for you." Roberto pressed a button on his desk, and moments later, his chief of security entered the room. "Prepare the men," Roberto ordered, his voice cold. "It's time we reminded San Esperanza what happens to those who stand in our way." As twilight fell over the town, storm clouds gathered on the horizon, a fitting backdrop for the confrontation to come. In the heart of San Esperanza, Father Hernandez knelt before the altar of his church, deep in prayer. The weight of the coming storm pressed heavily upon him, and he sought divine guidance for the trials ahead. A soft cough interrupted his devotions. The priest turned to find Chief Inspector Ramirez standing in the aisle, his face grave. "Father," Ramirez said, his voice low and urgent. "We have a problem. Our operation has been compromised." Father Hernandez rose, his aged joints protesting the movement. "Alejandro?" he asked, fearing the worst. Ramirez shook his head. "Not exactly. It seems there are more players in this game than we realized. Interpol is involved." As the inspector filled him in on the day's revelations, Father Hernandez felt a mix of hope and trepidation. "So, what now?" he asked when Ramirez had finished. "Now," Ramirez said, a determined glint in his eye, "we prepare for war. Roberto Fuentes won't go down without a fight, and we need to be ready." Meanwhile, across town, Alejandro paced the small room that had become his home, his mind racing. The events of the day had shaken him to his core, forcing him to question everything he thought he knew. A soft knock at the door startled him from his thoughts. He opened it cautiously, only to find Isabella standing there, her face pale and drawn. "May I come in?" she asked, her voice barely above a whisper. Alejandro hesitated for a moment before stepping aside. As Isabella entered, he couldn't help but notice how different she looked from the confident, ambitious woman who had broken his heart. Now, she seemed fragile, haunted. "I know I have no right to ask this of you," Isabella began, wringing her hands. "But I need your help, Alejandro. Roberto, he knows about everything. He has eyes and ears everywhere. We're not safe here." Alejandro's blood ran cold. If Roberto knew about their meeting, about Maria's true identity, then their entire operation was in jeopardy. But even as fear gripped him, a small voice in the back of his mind whispered a warning. Could he trust Isabella? After everything that had happened? Why should I believe you? He asked, his voice harsher than he intended. How do I know this isn't another one of Roberto's tricks? Tears welled up in Isabella's eyes. Because despite everything, Alejandro, I still love you. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but please, if not for me, then for the sake of San Esperanza. We have to stop Roberto before it's too late. As Alejandro struggled with his conflicting emotions, a commotion erupted outside. The sound of breaking glass and angry shouts filled the air. He rushed to the window, Isabella close behind him. In the street below, a group of men were smashing the windows of shops and overturning market stalls. Leading them was a face Alejandro recognized, one of Roberto's top lieutenants. It's starting, Isabella whispered, her voice trembling. Roberto's making his move. In that moment, Alejandro knew he had to act. Whatever his feelings for Isabella, whatever doubts still lingered, the people of San Esperanza needed him. He had made a vow to protect his community, and he would see it through, no matter the cost. We need to warn the others, he said, already moving towards the door. Maria, Father Hernandez, Chief Ramirez, they need to know what's happening. As they hurried down the stairs and out into the chaos-filled streets, Alejandro felt a strange calm settle over him. The path ahead was fraught with danger, the odds stacked against them. But he was no longer the naive vegetable seller who had been so easily manipulated. He had been tested, betrayed, and forged anew in the crucible of adversity. Now, as San Esperanza teetered on the brink of disaster, Alejandro Mendoza stood ready to fight for everything he held dear. The humble man had found his strength, and the true battle for the soul of his beloved town was about to begin. As they navigated the increasingly violent streets, Alejandro and Isabella made their way to the old lighthouse where he had first learned of the full scope of Roberto's plans. It had become a makeshift headquarters for their resistance, a beacon of hope in the gathering darkness. They found Maria, Father Hernandez, and Chief Ramirez already there, huddled around a table strewn with maps and documents. All three looked up as Alejandro and Isabella burst in, their faces a mix of relief and wariness. Thank God you're safe, Father Hernandez said, moving to embrace Alejandro. But he stopped short when he saw Isabella, his expression hardening. What is she doing here? Before Alejandro could respond, Maria stepped forward, her keen eyes assessing Isabella. Mrs. Fuentes, she said coolly. I trust you've come to make good on your offer of information? Isabella nodded, reaching into her bag to produce a flash drive. Everything's here, she said, her voice shaking slightly. Bank records, shipping manifests, names of corrupt officials, all of it. It's enough to bring down not just Roberto, but the entire network. Chief Ramirez took the drive, his face grim. If this checks out, it could change everything. But we need time to verify it, to plan our next move. Time is something we don't have, Alejandro interjected, quickly filling them in on the violence erupting in the streets. Roberto's making his play now. We have to stop him before innocent people get hurt. As the group debated their options, a new voice joined the fray, one that sent a chill down Alejandro's spine. How touching, Roberto Fuentes drawled, stepping out from the shadows of the lighthouse. The noble resistance, plotting to save their precious town. Everyone froze, shock and fear etched on their faces. Roberto's eyes gleamed with malice as he surveyed the room, a squad of armed men filing in behind him. Did you really think I wouldn't have this place under surveillance? He asked, his tone mocking. Oh, my dear Isabella. Your betrayal stings the most. But no matter. Soon, San Esperanza will be nothing but a memory, and you'll all be footnotes in my rise to power. Alejandro's mind raced, searching for a way out of this impossible situation. But even as despair threatened to overwhelm him, he felt a surge of defiance. He had come too far, sacrificed too much, to give up now. "You're wrong, Roberto," he said, his voice steady despite the fear coursing through him. "San Esperanza isn't just a town. It's a spirit, a community. And that's something you'll never understand, let alone defeat." Roberto's face twisted with rage. "Brave words from a man about to die," he snarled, raising his hand to signal his men. "Any last requests before I wipe you and your pathetic resistance off the map?" In that moment, as death seemed certain, Alejandro thought of all the people who had shaped his journey, his parents, who had taught him the value of integrity, Maria, who had believed in him even when he doubted himself, Father Hernandez, whose faith had been a guiding light in the darkest times. And then, unbidden, came thoughts of Isabella. Despite her betrayal, despite the pain she had caused, a part of him still cared for her. In her misguided way, she had tried to make things right. Could he find it in his heart to forgive her, even now at the end? As Roberto's men raised their weapons, time seemed to slow. Alejandro closed his eyes, sending up a silent prayer, not for himself, but for San Esperanza and all those he loved. But fate, it seemed, had one last twist in store for the humble vegetable seller turned unlikely hero. Just as Roberto gave the order to fire, the lighthouse was suddenly flooded with blinding light. The roar of helicopters filled the air, and a voice boomed out over a loudspeaker. "Roberto Fuentes. This is the federal police. We have you surrounded. Surrender now or face the consequences." In the chaos that followed, as Roberto and his men tried to make sense of this unexpected turn of events, Alejandro saw his chance. With a strength born of desperation, he lunged forward, tackling Roberto to the ground. The two men grappled fiercely, years of pent-up anger and resentment fueling their struggle. Around them, the world erupted into a frenzy of shouting and gunfire. Alejandro was vaguely aware of Maria and Chief Ramirez subduing Roberto's men, of Isabella and Father Hernandez huddled together in prayer. But his focus remained on Roberto, on finally bringing this monster to justice. As they fought, Roberto's mask of sophistication fell away, revealing the true face of the man who had nearly destroyed San Esperanza. "You think this changes anything?" he spat, struggling to break free from Alejandro's grip. "I have connections you can't imagine. I'll be out in no time, and when I am, I'll make you wish you'd never been born." Alejandro tightened his hold, his voice low and fierce. "No, Roberto. This ends here. Your reign of terror over San Esperanza is over." With a final burst of strength, Alejandro pinned Roberto to the ground just as federal agents stormed into the lighthouse. In a matter of moments, the once powerful Roberto Fuentes was in handcuffs, his empire crumbling around him. As the dust settled, Alejandro looked around in disbelief. Maria stood tall, conferring with the lead federal agent. Chief Ramirez was helping his officers secure the remaining members of Roberto's gang. Father Hernandez moved among the group, offering words of comfort and prayer to those shaken by the ordeal. And then there was Isabella, standing alone, her eyes fixed on Alejandro. As their gazes met, 1,000 unspoken words passed between them. The love they had shared, the pain of betrayal, the possibility of forgiveness, it all hung in the air, waiting to be addressed. But before Alejandro could approach her, he was swept up in a whirlwind of activity. There were statements to be given, evidence to be catalogued, a town to be reassured. The next few hours passed in a blur of activity and emotion. As dawn broke over San Esperanza, casting a golden light over the town square, Alejandro found himself standing before a crowd of his fellow citizens. They had gathered, eager for news, hungry for hope after the long night of uncertainty. Taking a deep breath, Alejandro addressed his community. "Friends, neighbors, family," he began, his voice carrying across the hushed square. "Last night, we faced a great evil. an evil that threatened not just our livelihoods, but the very soul of San Esperanza. He paused, looking out at the sea of familiar faces. But we stood strong. We stood together. And because of that, because of the unbreakable spirit of our community, we have prevailed. A cheer went up from the crowd, a cathartic release of fear and tension. Alejandro waited for it to subside before continuing. The road ahead will not be easy. There is much to rebuild, much to heal. But I stand before you today with hope in my heart. For I have seen the true strength of San Esperanza, and I know that together, there is nothing we cannot overcome. As Alejandro's words rang out across the square, a sense of renewal swept through the crowd. People embraced, tears of joy and relief flowing freely. The nightmare was over, and a new day was dawning for San Esperanza. In the days that followed, the town began the process of healing and rebuilding. The Fuentes Empire was dismantled, its ill-gotten assets seized and redistributed to help those who had been harmed. Alejandro's family's stand was restored to its rightful place in the market square, a symbol of resilience and tradition. But for Alejandro himself, the journey was not yet complete. There was still one loose end to tie up, one final act of courage he needed to find within himself. He found Isabella at the old church ruins, the place where their paths had crossed in such unexpected ways. She stood among the wildflowers, a solitary figure caught between past and future. "I didn't think you'd come," she said softly as Alejandro approached. "I almost didn't," he admitted, coming to stand beside her. "But we need to talk, Isabella. About everything." For a long moment, they stood in silence, the weight of their shared history hanging between them. Finally, Isabella spoke, her voice barely above a whisper. "I'm so sorry, Alejandro. For all of it. I was blind, selfish. I threw away the best thing in my life for a dream that turned into a nightmare." Alejandro took a deep breath, feeling the last vestiges of anger and hurt begin to fade. "I won't lie and say it didn't break my heart, Isabella. But these past weeks, they've taught me something important. About forgiveness, about second chances." He turned to face her, seeing the hope and fear warring in her eyes. "I don't know if we can ever go back to what we were," he said gently. "Too much has happened, too much has changed. But maybe we can start again. As friends, at least. And see where the path leads us." Tears spilled down Isabella's cheeks as she nodded, a tremulous smile breaking across her face. "I'd like that," she whispered. "More than anything." As they stood there, surrounded by the ruins of the past and the promise of the future, Alejandro felt a sense of peace settle over him. The journey had been long and painful, filled with betrayal and hardship. But it had also taught him the true meaning of strength, of community, of forgiveness. He, Alejandro Mendoza, the humble vegetable seller, had faced the darkness and emerged stronger. And now, with the sun rising on a new chapter for San Esperanza, he was ready to embrace whatever challenges and joys lay ahead. As they walked back towards town, side by side but not quite touching, Alejandro knew that the story of San Esperanza, and his own story, was far from over. But for the first time in a long while, he looked to the future with hope, ready to write the next chapter with an open heart and unwavering spirit. The humble man had been betrayed, had suffered, had almost lost everything. But in the end, it was his humility, his integrity, and his capacity for forgiveness that had truly saved him and his beloved town. And so, as the bells of the cathedral rang out across San Esperanza, heralding a new day and a new beginning, Alejandro Mendoza stepped forward into the light, ready to face whatever adventures awaited him next. 6 months had passed since the dramatic night that had changed San Esperanza forever. The town, once teetering on the brink of becoming a criminal stronghold, was now flourishing. The market square bustled with life, colorful stalls overflowing with fresh produce and handcrafted goods. Laughter and friendly chatter filled the air, a testament to the resilience of the community. At the heart of it all stood Alejandro Mendoza's vegetable stand, now expanded and more vibrant than ever. Alejandro himself moved among the crates of tomatoes and peppers, his face etched with contentment. The trials he had faced had left their mark, but they had also imbued him with a quiet strength and wisdom that drew people to him like never before. "Alejandro," a familiar voice called out. He looked up to see Maria approaching, her Interpol badge now proudly displayed on her belt. She had decided to stay in San Esperanza, using her experience to help the town rebuild and protect itself from future threats. "Maria," Alejandro greeted her warmly. "How goes the new security initiative?" Maria's eyes twinkled with enthusiasm. "Better than we could have hoped. The Community Watch program is up and running, and we've had inquiries from neighboring towns about implementing similar systems." As they chatted, Alejandro's gaze drifted across the square to where Isabella stood, helping a group of children plant flowers in the newly established community garden. Catching his eye, she offered a small smile and a wave. Their relationship had evolved over the past months, slowly rebuilding on a foundation of honesty and mutual respect. The wounds of the past were healing, though scars remained. They were not the same people they had been before, but perhaps, Alejandro mused, that wasn't entirely a bad thing. "You know," Maria said softly, following Alejandro's gaze, "forgiveness is a rare and precious thing. You've shown great strength in offering it." Alejandro nodded thoughtfully. "It hasn't been easy," he admitted. "But I've learned that holding on to anger only poisons your own soul. Isabella is trying to make amends, and I believe in second chances." Their conversation was interrupted by the arrival of Father Hernandez, his face creased with worry. "Alejandro, Maria," he said urgently, "I'm afraid I bring troubling news." Alejandro felt a familiar tightening in his chest. "What is it, Father?" The priest glanced around before lowering his voice. "I've received word from my contacts in the capital. It seems Roberto Fuentes is attempting to strike a deal with the authorities. He's offering information on other criminal organizations in exchange for a reduced sentence." Maria's expression darkened. "That snake," she hissed. "He's trying to slither his way out of facing true justice." Alejandro's mind raced. The thought of Roberto potentially walking free, even years down the line, sent a chill through him. "What can we do?" he asked. "That's why I've come to you," Father Hernandez replied. "The prosecutor handling the case is an old friend of mine. He's willing to meet with us, to hear our side of the story. But we must act quickly." As the implications of this news sank in, Alejandro felt the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders once more. He had hoped that with Roberto's arrest, the nightmare would be over. But it seemed that the battle for San Esperanza's future was not yet won. "When do we leave for the capital?" Alejandro asked, his voice filled with determination. "First thing tomorrow," Father Hernandez answered. "I'll make the arrangements." As the priest hurried off, Maria placed a comforting hand on Alejandro's arm. "You don't have to do this alone," she said. "We're all in this together." Alejandro nodded gratefully, but his eyes were drawn once more to Isabella. He knew that facing Roberto again, even in a courtroom, would dredge up painful memories for her. Could he ask her to relive that trauma? As if sensing his thoughts, Isabella made her way over to them. "I couldn't help but notice the serious conversation," she said, her voice tinged with concern. "Is everything all right?" Taking a deep breath, Alejandro filled her in on the situation. As he spoke, he watched a myriad of emotions play across Isabella's face: fear, anger, and finally, a steely resolve. "I'm coming with you," she declared once he had finished. "Isabella, you don't have to," Alejandro began, but she cut him off. "Yes, I do," she insisted. I was part of Roberto's world. I know things, details that could be crucial in ensuring he faces the full consequences of his actions. It's time I took full responsibility for my part in all of this." Alejandro marveled at the strength in her voice, so different from the lost, frightened woman she had been just months ago. He realized with a start that he was proud of her, of how far she had come. As word spread through the town about the impending trip to the capital, the community rallied around Alejandro and his companions. People brought food for their journey, offered prayers and words of encouragement. Chief Ramirez promised to keep a close eye on things while they were gone, ensuring that San Esperanza remained safe in their absence. That evening, as the sun set over the town, Alejandro found himself walking to the old lighthouse. It had become something of a sanctuary for him, a place to think and reflect. As he climbed the winding stairs to the top, he was surprised to find he wasn't alone. Isabella stood by the railing, gazing out at the horizon. She turned as Alejandro approached, her eyes shimmering with unshed tears. "I never properly thanked you," she said softly. "For what?" Alejandro asked, moving to stand beside her. "For believing in me. For giving me a chance to make things right." She paused, taking a shaky breath. "I know I hurt you deeply, Alejandro. There were times I didn't think I deserved your forgiveness." Alejandro was quiet for a moment, considering his words carefully. "Forgiveness isn't about deserving," he said finally. "It's a choice. One I had to make as much for myself as for you." He turned to face her fully, his expression earnest. "The past few months haven't been easy, Isabella. But I've seen how hard you've worked to rebuild trust, not just with me, but with the whole town. You're not the same person you were, and neither am I." Isabella's tears flowed freely now. Do you think there's hope for us? For a future together?" Alejandro reached out, gently wiping a tear from her cheek. "I think," he said slowly, "that the future is unwritten. We've been given a second chance, Isabella. What we do with it is up to us." As they stood there, bathed in the golden light of the setting sun, Alejandro felt a sense of peace wash over him. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, the specter of Roberto Fuentes looming over them once more. But in this moment, looking into Isabella's eyes and seeing the same hope and determination he felt in his own heart, Alejandro knew they could face whatever lay ahead. The humble vegetable seller who had been betrayed, who had nearly lost everything, had emerged from his trials not bitter, but stronger. He had rediscovered the power of forgiveness, the strength of community, and the enduring nature of love. As night fell over San Esperanza, its streets quiet but its spirit unbowed, Alejandro and Isabella made their way back to town hand in hand. Whatever the future held, they would face it together, supported by the unbreakable bonds of a community that had weathered the storm and come out stronger on the other side. The next chapter of their story was about to begin, and Alejandro Mendoza was ready to embrace it with an open heart and unwavering courage. For he had learned that true strength lay not in never falling, but in rising every time you fall, and in having the faith to offer second chances to others and to oneself. As they reached the town square, now bathed in the soft glow of streetlights, Alejandro paused. He looked around at the place that had shaped him, that he had fought so hard to protect. From the ancient cathedral to the humble market stalls, from the laughing children to the wizened elders, San Esperanza was more than just a town. It was a living, breathing entity, a tapestry woven from the hopes, dreams, and resilience of its people. And as he stood there, with Isabella by his side and the support of his community behind him, Alejandro made a silent vow. No matter what challenges lay ahead, no matter what ghosts from the past might resurface, he would stand firm. For San Esperanza. For justice. For the future they were all building together. With renewed purpose, Alejandro squared his shoulders and took a step forward. The journey to the capital awaited, and with it, the chance to ensure that Roberto Fuentes would face the full weight of his crimes. But whatever the outcome, Alejandro knew that the true victory had already been won in the resilience of his community, in the strength he had found within himself, and in the power of forgiveness to heal even the deepest wounds. As he and Isabella walked towards home, ready to prepare for the journey ahead, the bells of the cathedral began to toll. Their rich, deep tones rang out across San Esperanza, a reminder of the town's enduring spirit and a promise of brighter days to come. The humble man who had been betrayed had not just survived, he had triumphed. And his story, like that of San Esperanza itself, was far from over. It was, in many ways, just beginning. The capital city loomed before them, a sprawling metropolis of gleaming skyscrapers and bustling streets that seemed a world away from the quiet charm of San Esperanza. Alejandro Mendoza stood on the steps of the courthouse, his heart pounding with a mixture of determination and apprehension. Beside him, Isabella squeezed his hand reassuringly, while Maria and Father Hernandez flanked them, a united front against the challenges that lay ahead. As they entered the imposing building, Alejandro couldn't help but feel out of place. His simple, well-worn clothes stood in stark contrast to the sleek suits and polished shoes of the lawyers and officials hurrying through the marble halls. But he squared his shoulders, remembering that he carried with him the hopes and trust of all San Esperanza. The hearing was set to begin in less than an hour. Roberto Fuentes, the man who had nearly destroyed everything Alejandro held dear, would soon be facing justice. But the stakes were higher than ever. Roberto's offer to turn informant threatened to undermine the very foundations of justice they had fought so hard to uphold. As they were led to a waiting room, Alejandro's mind wandered back to the journey that had brought them here. The long nights of preparation, poring over documents and rehearsing testimonies. The tearful goodbyes from the townspeople who had pressed small tokens of support into their hands, a rosary, a lucky charm, a child's drawing of a triumphant Alejandro. His reverie was interrupted by the arrival of Prosecutor Elena Vasquez, a stern-faced woman with kind eyes that reminded Alejandro of his mother. "Señor Mendoza," she greeted him, her voice businesslike but not unkind. "I understand you and your companions have traveled far to be here today. I want you to know that I take the concerns of San Esperanza very seriously." Alejandro nodded gratefully. "Thank you, Señora Vasquez. We appreciate the opportunity to be heard." As the prosecutor briefed them on what to expect during the hearing, Alejandro felt a familiar presence at his side. He turned to see Isabella, her face pale but resolute. "Are you ready for this?" he asked softly, concern evident in his voice. Isabella took a deep breath, squaring her shoulders. "As ready as I'll ever be," she replied. "It's time I faced Roberto and my past head-on." Before Alejandro could respond, the door opened and a court official appeared. "It's time," he announced solemnly. As they filed into the courtroom, Alejandro felt as if he were stepping onto a battlefield. The room was packed, filled with journalists, legal observers, and curious onlookers. And there, at the defendant's table, sat Roberto Fuentes. Alejandro's breath caught in his throat as he laid eyes on his former tormentor for the first time in months. Roberto looked diminished somehow, his designer suit hanging loosely on his frame, dark circles shadowing his eyes. But as their gazes met, Alejandro saw a flicker of the old arrogance, the calculating intelligence that had nearly brought San Esperanza to its knees. The proceedings began, a whirlwind of legal jargon and formal procedures that left Alejandro's head spinning. He listened intently as Prosecutor Vasquez laid out the case against Roberto, detailing the years of corruption, violence, and exploitation that had marked his reign over San Esperanza. And then, it was their turn to speak. One by one, Alejandro and his companions took the stand. Father Hernandez spoke of the fear that had gripped the town, the way Roberto's influence had seeped into every aspect of life in San Esperanza. Maria, in her capacity as an Interpol agent, provided damning evidence of Roberto's connections to international crime syndicates. When it was Isabella's turn to testify, Alejandro held his breath. He watched as she took the stand, her eyes never leaving Roberto's face as she recounted her part in his schemes and the devastating consequences they had wrought. "I was blinded by ambition and the promise of a life beyond San Esperanza," Isabella said, her voice steady despite the tears that threatened to fall. "But I've seen the true cost of that ambition. The lives ruined, the community nearly destroyed. I'm here today not to ask for forgiveness, but to ensure that justice is served for all of Roberto's victims." As Isabella stepped down from the stand, Alejandro saw something he never expected, a flicker of genuine emotion on Roberto's face. Regret? Remorse? Or simply the realization that his carefully constructed world was crumbling around him? Finally, it was Alejandro's turn to speak. As he took his place before the judge, he felt the weight of San Esperanza on his shoulders. This was his moment to give voice to all those who had suffered under Roberto's reign, to fight for the future of the town he loved. "Your Honor," Alejandro began, his voice growing stronger with each word, "I stand before you not just as Alejandro Mendoza, but as a representative of every citizen of San Esperanza. Our town may be small, but its spirit is mighty. We have weathered storms, faced betrayals, and come out stronger for it." He went on to recount the darkest days of Roberto's control over the town, the fear, the corruption, the loss of hope. But he also spoke of resilience, of a community coming together in the face of adversity. Roberto Fuentes didn't just commit crimes against individuals, Alejandro continued, his passion evident in every word. He attempted to steal the very soul of San Esperanza. To reduce a vibrant community to nothing more than a pawn in his games of power and greed. But he underestimated us. He underestimated the power of unity, of integrity, of love for one's home and neighbors. As Alejandro spoke, he noticed a change coming over the courtroom. The journalists leaned forward, their pens scribbling furiously. The observers sat rapt, hanging on his every word. Even the judge, who had seemed impassive throughout the proceedings, was watching him intently. "Your Honor," Alejandro concluded, his voice ringing with conviction, "Roberto Fuentes may offer information on other criminals, but at what cost? If we allow him to bargain his way to a lighter sentence, what message does that send? That crime pays, as long as you have powerful friends to betray? That the suffering of an entire town can be brushed aside for the sake of expediency?" He paused, looking directly at Roberto for the first time since entering the courtroom. "I stand before you today not seeking vengeance, but justice. True justice that recognizes the full weight of Roberto Fuentes' crimes and ensures that he can never again threaten the peace and well-being of any community. San Esperanza has found the strength to forgive, to rebuild. But we cannot truly heal until we know that the man who nearly destroyed us has been held fully accountable for his actions." As Alejandro stepped down from the stand, a hushed murmur rippled through the courtroom. He made his way back to his seat, his heart pounding. Had he said enough? Had he honored the trust placed in him by his friends, his community? The rest of the hearing passed in a blur. Closing arguments were made, final pieces of evidence submitted. And then, finally, it was time for the judge to make her decision. As the courtroom waited with bated breath, Alejandro felt Isabella's hand slip into his. He looked at her, saw the mixture of hope and fear in her eyes that he knew was mirrored in his own. Whatever happened next, they would face it together. In the case of the people versus Roberto Fuentes, the judge began, her voice ringing out in the silent courtroom, "This court has carefully considered all evidence and testimony presented. The crimes committed by the defendant are numerous and grave, striking at the very heart of justice and community trust." She paused, her gaze sweeping the courtroom before landing squarely on Roberto. While the court recognizes the potential value of the defendant's offer to provide information on other criminal enterprises, we must weigh this against the severity of his own actions and the impact they have had on countless lives. Alejandro held his breath, scarcely daring to hope. It is the finding of this court, the judge continued, that the interests of justice cannot be served by allowing the defendant to escape the full consequences of his actions. Therefore, Roberto Fuentes is hereby sentenced to the maximum term allowable by law, without possibility of early release or plea bargain. A collective gasp went up from the courtroom, followed by a burst of applause that the bailiff quickly silenced. Alejandro sat stunned, scarcely able to believe what he had heard. They had done it. San Esperanza would have its justice. As Roberto was led away in handcuffs, Alejandro caught a final glimpse of the man who had loomed so large in his nightmares. But now, stripped of his power and facing a future behind bars, Roberto Fuentes seemed small, diminished. The spell was broken at last. Outside the courthouse, a crowd had gathered, journalists clamoring for statements, curious onlookers drawn by the commotion. But pushing through them all came familiar faces: Chief Ramirez, Maria's fellow agents, and to Alejandro's astonishment, a large delegation from San Esperanza itself. "We couldn't let you face this alone," explained Dona Rosa, the town's eldest resident, as she enveloped Alejandro in a warm embrace. San Esperanza stands together, in good times and in bad. As the news of the verdict spread, a spontaneous celebration erupted. There, on the steps of the capital's courthouse, the spirit of San Esperanza bloomed like a flower breaking through concrete. People laughed, cried, embraced one another with joy and relief. Alejandro found himself at the center of it all, shaking hands, receiving hugs and words of gratitude. But his eyes sought out Isabella, finding her standing slightly apart from the crowd, watching the scene with a mixture of joy and wistfulness. He made his way to her side, taking her hand in his. "We did it," he said softly. "It's really over." Isabella nodded, tears shining in her eyes. "Yes," she whispered. "But what happens now? Where do we go from here?" Alejandro considered her words carefully. The journey that had brought them to this moment had been long and painful, filled with betrayal and hardship. But it had also taught them both, invaluable lessons about strength, forgiveness, and the power of community. "Now," he said, his voice filled with quiet conviction, "we go home. We rebuild. Not just buildings or businesses, but trust. Relationships. We take everything we've learned and use it to make San Esperanza stronger than ever." He paused, looking deep into Isabella's eyes. "And as for us, we take it one day at a time. We've been given a second chance, Isabella. A chance to build something new, something stronger, based on honesty and mutual respect. If you're willing to try, so am I." Isabella's face lit up with a smile that reminded Alejandro of the woman he had first fallen in love with, but tempered now with wisdom, with the hard-won knowledge of life's complexities. "I'd like that," she said softly. "Very much." As the sun began to set over the capital city, painting the sky in hues of gold and crimson, Alejandro gathered his friends and fellow townsfolk. It was time to return to San Esperanza, to share the news of their victory and begin the next chapter of their story. The journey home was filled with laughter, tears, and heartfelt conversations. Plans were made for the town's future, new community projects, reforms to ensure transparency in local government, initiatives to help those who had been most affected by Roberto's reign. And through it all, Alejandro felt a profound sense of gratitude. For the strength he had found within himself, for the unwavering support of his community, and for the power of forgiveness to heal even the deepest wounds. As their bus crested the final hill, the familiar silhouette of San Esperanza came into view. The sight of their town, nestled against the backdrop of rolling hills and the distant sea brought tears to Alejandro's eyes. They had left as a group united by fear and uncertainty. They returned as heroes, bearing with them the promise of justice and a brighter future. As they disembarked in the town square, greeted by cheering crowds and the joyous pealing of church bells, Alejandro took a moment to look around. At Father Hernandez, whose faith had been a guiding light in the darkest times. At Maria, whose dedication to justice had helped expose the truth. At Chief Ramirez, steadfast in his duty to protect the town. And at Isabella, standing tall and proud, ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead, together. In that moment, Alejandro Mendoza, the humble vegetable seller who had been betrayed, who had nearly lost everything, felt his heart swell with an emotion too profound for words. He had rediscovered the power of forgiveness, the strength of community, and the enduring nature of love. The road ahead would not always be easy. There would be challenges to face, wounds still to heal. But as he stood there, surrounded by the people he loved in the town that had shaped him, Alejandro knew one thing with absolute certainty. San Esperanza had weathered the storm. And together, they would build a future brighter than any of them had dared to dream. As night fell and stars began to twinkle in the velvet sky, the celebrations in San Esperanza continued. Music filled the air, blending with laughter and the excited chatter of people sharing their hopes for the future. Alejandro found himself drawn to his family's vegetable stand, now closed for the day but still a beacon of normalcy amidst all the change. He ran his hand along the worn wood, feeling the grooves and nicks that told the story of generations of Mendozas serving their community. So much had changed, and yet this simple stand remained, a testament to the enduring spirit of San Esperanza. "I thought I might find you here," came Isabella's voice, soft and warm in the evening air. Alejandro turned to see her approaching, her face aglow in the soft light of the street lamps. "Just remembering where it all began," he said with a small smile. Isabella nodded, understanding in her eyes. "You know," she said, leaning against the stand beside him, "when I first met you, I thought this was too small a stage for someone like you. I couldn't understand how you could be content with such a simple life." She paused, her gaze sweeping across the vibrant town square. "But now I see that I was the one with the limited vision. You saw the richness in this life, the beauty in serving your community. You understood something I'm only now beginning to grasp, that true wealth isn't measured in money or power, but in the lives you touch, the differences you make." Alejandro felt a warmth spreading through his chest at her words. "We've both learned a lot," he said softly. "And we have so much more to learn, together." As they stood there, the sounds of celebration washing over them, Alejandro felt a sense of rightness, of coming full circle. The humble vegetable stand that had been the center of his world for so long was still here, still important. But now it was just one part of a much larger picture, a picture that included justice, redemption, and the promise of a love renewed. "What do you say we join the festivities?" Alejandro asked, offering his hand to Isabella. "After all, this is as much your victory as it is mine. You found the courage to stand up to Roberto, to help bring him to justice. San Esperanza owes you a debt of gratitude too." Isabella hesitated for a moment, a flicker of old insecurities passing across her face. But then she smiled, taking Alejandro's hand firmly in hers. "Lead the way," she said. "It's time I truly became a part of this community." As they walked back towards the center of the celebration, Alejandro felt as if his heart might burst with joy and hope for the future. The path ahead was uncharted, full of possibilities both thrilling and terrifying. But he knew that with the strength of his community behind him and Isabella by his side, he could face anything. The humble man who had been betrayed had not just survived, he had triumphed. And his story, like that of San Esperanza itself, was far from over. It was, in many ways, just beginning. As the night wore on and the celebration began to wind down, Alejandro found himself drawn to the old lighthouse on the edge of town. It had been a place of secrets and confrontations, but now, standing tall and proud against the star-studded sky, it seemed to represent something else, a beacon of hope, guiding San Esperanza into a brighter future. Alejandro climbed the winding stairs, his footsteps echoing in the quiet. As he reached the top, he was surprised to find he wasn't alone. Father Hernandez stood by the railing, gazing out at the twinkling lights of the town below. "I had a feeling I might find you here, my son," the priest said, smiling warmly as Alejandro approached. "I needed a moment of quiet," Alejandro admitted, joining Father Hernandez at the railing. "To process everything that's happened." The old priest nodded understandingly. "It's been quite a journey, hasn't it? From betrayal to redemption, from despair to hope. You've faced trials that would have broken a lesser man, Alejandro." Alejandro was quiet for a moment, reflecting on the tumultuous path that had led him to this point. "There were times I thought I wouldn't make it," he confessed. "Times when the weight of it all seemed too much to bear. But you persevered," Father Hernandez said, placing a comforting hand on Alejandro's shoulder. "You held on to your integrity, your compassion. You found the strength to forgive even when it seemed impossible. That, my son, is true courage." As they stood there, the cool night breeze carrying the distant sounds of the town's continued celebration, Alejandro felt a profound sense of peace wash over him. He thought of Isabella, of the second chance they had been given. He thought of his community, united and stronger than ever. And he thought of himself, the humble vegetable seller who had discovered reserves of strength and resilience he never knew he possessed. "What happens now, Father?" Alejandro asked, his voice barely above a whisper. "How do we move forward from here?" Father Hernandez smiled, his eyes twinkling with wisdom and hope. "We rebuild, Alejandro. Not just our town, but our hearts and spirits. We take the lessons we've learned about forgiveness, about the power of community, about the importance of standing up for what's right, and we use them to create a better future. For ourselves, for our children, for all of San Esperanza." Alejandro nodded, feeling a renewed sense of purpose coursing through him. "You're right," he said, straightening his shoulders. "This isn't the end of our story. It's a new beginning." As if on cue, the first light of dawn began to paint the horizon, casting a golden glow over San Esperanza. Alejandro watched in awe as the town he loved so dearly came alive in the morning light, full of promise and potential. "Shall we head back?" Father Hernandez asked, gesturing towards the stairs. "I believe there's still much work to be done." Alejandro smiled, feeling ready to face whatever challenges lay ahead. "Yes," he agreed. "Let's go home." As they made their way down the lighthouse stairs and back towards the town square, Alejandro's heart swelled with emotion. He saw Isabella waiting for him at the bottom, her face radiant with love and hope. He saw his friends and neighbors, tired from the night's celebrations but eager to begin the work of rebuilding their community. And he saw San Esperanza itself, no longer overshadowed by fear and corruption, but shining with the promise of a new day. The humble man who had been betrayed had emerged from his trials not bitter, but stronger. He had rediscovered the power of forgiveness, the strength of community, and the enduring nature of love. And as he took Isabella's hand and walked towards their future together, Alejandro Mendoza knew that the greatest chapters of their story were still to be written. In the years that followed, San Esperanza flourished. The town became known not just for its picturesque beauty or its bustling market, but for its spirit of resilience and unity. Visitors would often remark on the special quality of the place, the warmth of its people, the strength of its community bonds. And at the heart of it all, you could still find Alejandro Mendoza at his vegetable stand, a living testament to the power of humility, integrity, and unwavering love for one's home and people. His story, whispered among the townspeople and passed down to their children, became a legend of sorts, a reminder that even in the darkest of times, hope and goodness can prevail. For Alejandro and Isabella, each day brought new joys and challenges as they worked side by side to nurture their rekindled love and serve their community. Their journey was far from over, but they faced it together, stronger for the trials they had overcome. And so, as the sun set on another day in San Esperanza, casting long shadows across the town square and painting the sky in brilliant hues of orange and pink, the story of the humble man's betrayal and triumph came to a close. But in many ways, it was just the beginning of an even greater tale, one of renewal, of second chances, and of the enduring power of love and community to overcome all obstacles.